on HLN. Good to see you, Jason. And Wendy Murphy, a former prosecutor and law professor in Boston. Good to see you as well, Wendy. So, Jason, let me begin with you. The president said too often, you just heard it, too often black boys, men are disproportionately victims or perpetrators, and that he, too, before being senator, has been treated like a suspect, whether it be in an elevator, in a store. This is a discussion and concern that has gone on for years. But is all of this now being interpreted differently now that the president of the United States has addressed it in this way?
I don't know if it's going to be interpreted differently, but I think it adds a final voice. The president's one small statement after the verdict, it wasn't really strong enough. And you had Jimmy Carter talking, you had Charles Barkley talking, you had a lot of different people talking. But I think Obama sort of puts the bookend on this discussion and moves the country forward. And it was a brave and candid Barack Obama that the black community certainly has not seen in the last several years. This wasn't even the Obama that spoke at Morehouse. So I was surprised and impressed by his candor and sincerity in speaking on the subject. And
Wendy, you write about injustice for women, but as an attorney, have you taken notice, or how often have you taken notice at the courthouse and the jailhouse that is the case, as the president puts it, disproportionately victims and perpetrators are that of black men? So hearing the president yesterday, did that change your thoughts, crystallize your thoughts in any way on what you see in the criminal justice system?
Well, it's interesting. So in my book on Justice for Some, I do write primarily about disproportionate failure to redress targeted violence against women and children as a systemic failure in our legal system. But some of the same problems, the structured inequality that I write about in my book and that I teach about at my law school, apply with equal force, if not more so, to the black community, including in particular black men. I was at a prison recently visiting a client, and virtually everyone I saw had brown skin. And I asked a guard about it, and he said, oh, most are here for drugs, and it's just a huge cyclical problem. And that's not news. What I loved about what the president did was he essentially acknowledged the legitimacy of what I write about in my book. But what he said was, look, I'm the government, and he's the most powerful representative of the government in this country. And he was essentially saying the government is unfair. The system is unfair. And boy, is that important to hear from someone like that. His leadership on this issue, having him say that, be self-critical in that way, I thought was huge and really a very important moment.
And beyond that, saying that it too needs reform. And an example of that, and he says he didn't have all of the answers, but an example might be the Justice Department assist local law enforcement in training. Is that where the training, is that where the assistance should best come from? Is that a reasonable offer?
I don't think that's enough, but I think it's a start. Barack Obama said, when he was a senator, when he was in Illinois, he put out information on where racial profiling comes from and what's the impact. But I think the larger issue is this. He needs to address structural inequalities in sentencing. He needs to address structural inequalities in education. He needs to address structural inequalities in hiring. It's very interesting. One of the first bills that Barack Obama signed quietly after he became president was to close the gap between punishments between powder cocaine and crack cocaine, which is something that had been sending significantly larger numbers of African Americans to jail for longer sentences for years. He needs to do more of that to address some of these issues.
Is that what the president can do? Because even he said, he's not necessarily turning to Congress because he says, fighting about it is not going to get you anywhere, and asking for yet another program isn't necessarily the answer too. But he did say that perhaps it is more reasonable to rely on the clergy. It is more productive to rely on the business community. He essentially is saying government is not necessarily the answer. Wendy?
Yeah. Well, I think he's right in a sense. The solutions come from all sorts of sources. Institutional sources are particularly important because they frame how we think about things, and attitudes are part of the solution as well. I think leadership is the most important thing he has to offer. Leadership has been lacking on this issue. I frankly did not see everything the president said as sufficient. I want to know, for example, why my president didn't speak out about how the 3 young women enslaved in a basement in chains in Ohio in Ariel Castro's home for 10 years, Why didn't he think that was enough of a civil rights issue to speak out about? Why didn't he say those girls could have been my daughters? I think one of the things he has to do next is say, we're never really all going to come together on racism and the problem of racism unless we see all civil rights violations as the same problem.
And Jason, last word?
Well, you know, I really think that this was the one example where I think it's okay for a president to speak on a local issue. As a rule, as an American, I don't want the president invading every single state issue. But when you see that a large number of people in the country are unhappy with the system, it is the time for the president to speak as a moral leader and say, look, it's time for calm, it's time for concern. And I think it was a good thing he did. I don't think that he didn't care about the women in Ariel Castron's case or even Steubenville. It's just this was an issue that many, many more people were concerned about right now.
And I'm just thinking further about that, not that I would be, you know, responding for the White House in any way, shape, or form, but there doesn't seem to be any really discord when you're talking about child abuse. But there is discord when you talk about issues of race.
Oh, yes, there is. Oh, yes, there is. It just doesn't get nearly enough airtime. 5 children die
perhaps that's another segment that we need to book another time and have you back to educate us on that. Wendy Murphy, thank you so much. Jason Johnson, good to see you as well. Appreciate it.
Thank you.
All right, we are going to talk indeed more about the George Zimmerman trial. Will it